Plainfield, Wisconsin, a quiet, small town where everyone knew everyone, a place that promised safety and banality. But behind its rustic facade, Plainfield concealed an unimaginable darkness, a darkness personified by one of the most notorious criminals in American history, Edward Theodore Gein. Many know him by the infamous moniker, the Butcher of Plainfield. His shocking deeds, uncovered in the late 1950s, rattled America and inspired some of the most terrifying horror films ever made, from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. His crimes defined a new era of fear, the monster next door. The story of Ed Gein is not just about murder, but about a chilling progression of isolation, obsession, and a necrophilia that culminated in the desecration of human remains and the creation of macabre souvenirs. What authorities discovered in his farmhouse, a home that stood as a monument to madness, defied all human comprehension. Who truly was Ed Gein? And how did a quiet, strange man, considered utterly harmless by his neighbors, manage to become a living nightmare? To understand the horror, we must first look into the roots of his fractured psyche. Born in 1906, Ed Gein's childhood was severely marked by isolation and religious fanaticism. His father, George, was a weak alcoholic, often unemployed. The true, terrifyingly dominant force in the Gein household was his mother, Augusta Gein. Augusta was a bigoted, domineering, and deeply paranoid woman. She firmly believed that the world, and especially all other women, were sources of sin and depravity. Ed and his brother, Henry, were strictly isolated from the outside world. Their world was reduced to the secluded farm and their mother's constant, punishing sermons. Augusta constantly admonished her sons, preaching relentlessly about the curse of lust and the necessity of sexual abstinence. For Ed, in particular, Augusta was the sole virtuous woman in existence. He was pathologically devoted to her, forming an unhealthy emotional dependency that bordered on worship. The Gein farm was not a home, it was a psychological prison. When Ed's father died in 1940, the control Augusta exerted only intensified. In 1944, tragedy struck again when Henry died under ambiguous circumstances during a farm fire. Although officially ruled accidental, some speculation persisted that Ed may have played a dark, hidden role. But the definitive, shattering moment came in 1945. Augusta Gein passed away after a series of strokes. At 39 years old, Ed Gein was finally and utterly alone. The single guiding light in his life, no matter how distorted, was extinguished, leaving behind an overwhelming void that his broken psyche was incapable of filling. The death of Augusta triggered a state of psychological collapse in Ed. In a desperate, bizarre act, he sealed off his mother's bedroom and the parlor, preserving them exactly as they were, a grotesque, frozen shrine. The rest of the house quickly began to fall into disrepair, a perfect physical reflection of the decay of his own mind. Gein was now living a solitary existence in a dark, silent home. To fill the overwhelming void, he began reading death cult magazines, sensationalistic adventure stories, and later, medical textbooks focusing on human anatomy and the process of preservation. His interest in the dead became an intellectual obsession. But passive reading was not enough to satisfy the hunger. The morbid fantasies born from his extreme isolation and his mother's warped teachings soon demanded a physical, terrifying manifestation in the real world. Around 1947, Ed Gein turned his attention to the Plainfield Cemetery. He began to secretly exhume the bodies of recently deceased middle-aged women whom he believed bore some physical resemblance to his beloved, lost mother. What started as a desperate, perverse attempt to connect with the memory of Augusta quickly descended into necrophilia and a bizarre form of macabre artistry. Gein would take body parts back to his desolate farm, experimenting with the human remains he procured. He later confessed to visiting the cemetery up to 40 times, though he claimed to only remember successfully digging up about 10 graves. At this stage, he was not primarily driven by the act of murder. He was driven by what was left behind. The remains became his hideous raw material. For years, Ed Gein was nothing more than the odd handyman in Plainfield, a quiet, harmless eccentric. He sometimes babysat for neighbors and was frequently seen around town, often doing odd jobs for meager pay. Nobody suspected that the man they knew was constructing a private chamber of horrors inside his secluded, rotting home. But his depraved activities inevitably escalated. The impulse to possess and create transitioned from the bodies of the dead to the bodies of the living. November 16, 1957, the owner of the local hardware store, Bernice Worden, suddenly vanished. Her son, Frank, went to open the store that morning and found the till open and large spots of blood on the floor. The last customer known to have been in the store was Ed Gein. Sheriff Art Schley and Deputy Frank Worden, the victim's son, immediately drove out to Jane's farm. What they encountered there became one of the most infamously grotesque crime scenes in American history. Inside the dimly lit summer kitchen or shed, they found Bernice Worden's body. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and her body was gruesomely suspended upside down, field-dressed like a deer. The house itself was a museum of the utterly grotesque. In the kitchen, a bowl made from a human skull sat on a table. Chairs were macabrely upholstered with human skin. A lampshade was crafted from the skin of a human face. Authorities compiled a terrifying inventory. Bowls made from skulls, leggings made from leg skin, a corset made from a female torso, and the infamous face masks, trophies of his nocturnal raids and the murders of both Bernice Worden and the other missing woman, Mary Hogan, who had vanished in 1954. When finally confronted, Ed Gein confessed almost immediately, detailing his grave robberies and the murders of the two women. His motive was chillingly simple and pathologically insane. He wasn't driven by lust or greed, but by an obsessive need to create a permanent substitute companion, or perhaps a permanent piece of his mother. The news of the Plainfield horrors spread like wildfire across the nation. The seemingly quiet, isolated farm became the immediate focus of global media. Ed Gein's story was a profound cultural shockwave, irrefutable proof that unimaginable evil could lurk behind the most unassuming exterior. Ed Gein was swiftly taken into custody. When questioned about his macabre creations, he allegedly responded with a horrifying sense of detachment, saying he made the skin objects simply because he had them. The sheer banality of his response made the entire scope of the horror even more profound. Gein was initially found unfit to stand trial in 1957 due to legal insanity. He was diagnosed as a severe schizophrenic who suffered from lifelong sexual and mental confusion, and he was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. A decade later, in 1968, he was briefly found competent to stand trial. He was convicted of the murder of Bernice Worden, but due to his plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, he was found not guilty and permanently remanded to a maximum security mental hospital. During this period in 1958, the Gein farmhouse, the literal house of horrors, mysteriously burned to the ground. It was widely believed to be the act of arson by locals desperate to erase the terrible stain on their community. The physical evidence was gone, but the legacy of terror remained. Gein was essentially lost to the system after that. He was deemed a quiet, compliant patient for the rest of his life. Yet, his case continued to haunt the public imagination, influencing the very definition of the term serial killer, even though he only committed 2 known murders. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 78, due to respiratory failure and cancer, and was buried next to his mother in the Plainfield cemetery, the very ground he once desecrated. Gein personified a deep, dark shift in the American consciousness. He proved that the most horrifying acts could be committed not by strangers in the dark, but by the quiet man down the road, the neighbor you barely noticed, the one who lived in the decaying farmhouse. The story of Ed Gein remains a chilling reminder of the destructive power of extreme isolation, pathological obsession, and the complete collapse of a mind left unanchored. The horrors he wrought in Plainfield, Wisconsin, may have been buried with him, but the fear he inspired still lingers, a perpetual whisper in the quiet American night.